When economic warnings are issued, most of them are forgotten within months. They are either too vague, too political, or too reactive. Ray Dalio is different, not because he is always right, but because his warnings are built on repeatable historical patterns, measured across centuries, not quarters. Dalio is the founder of Bridgewater Associates, the world's largest hedge fund for much of the last 3 decades. At its peak, Bridgewater managed over $160 billion. Dalio advised governments, central banks, and sovereign wealth funds. More importantly, he documented his thinking publicly, often years before events unfolded. When Dalio warns about an economic cycle, he is not forecasting a date. He is identifying structural pressures that historically resolve in only a few ways. His message is uncomfortable because it challenges the assumption that modern economies have escaped historical constraints. This video is not about fear. It is about mechanics. Ray Dalio was born in 1949 in Queens, New York. His father was a jazz musician. Dalio began investing at age 12, buying shares of Northeast Airlines after noticing increased demand during the airline strike. The stock tripled. The lesson stuck. After earning an MBA from Harvard Business School, Dalio founded Bridgewater in 1975 from his apartment. Early on, he failed badly. In 1982, Dalio predicted a depression following the Latin American debt crisis. Instead, markets rallied. Bridgewater nearly collapsed. Dalio later said this failure forced him to confront the limits of opinion-based forecasting. He rebuilt Bridgewater around radical transparency, data-driven decision-making, and historical study. The result was a system that treated economies like machines governed by incentives, debt, and human behavior. This shift was foundational. Dalio stopped asking what should happen and started asking what always happens under similar conditions. Dalio's most famous idea is the economic machine, popularized in his 2013 video, How the Economic Machine Works. The premise is simple but powerful. An economy is driven by productivity growth and debt cycles. Productivity grows slowly. Debt grows faster. Debt allows spending to exceed income temporarily. When managed properly, this smooths growth. When mismanaged, it amplifies booms and busts. Dalio separates cycles into short-term debt cycles, typically lasting 5 to 8 years, and long-term debt cycles, lasting 50 to 75 years. The short-term cycle is managed through interest rates. The long-term cycle ends when debt levels become too high to service through normal means. According to Dalio, the United States is late in a long-term debt cycle. Dalio defines a late-cycle economy not by recession headlines, but by measurable conditions: high debt relative to income, low interest rates, large fiscal deficits, asset prices elevated by liquidity rather than fundamentals. By 2020, U.S. federal debt exceeded 100% of GDP, a level historically associated with reduced flexibility. By 2024, it surpassed $34 trillion, with interest expense approaching $1 trillion annually as rates normalized. Dalio repeatedly warned that when interest rates are low and debt is high, policymakers lose their primary tools. You cannot cut rates meaningfully. You cannot borrow without consequences. What remains is money printing and fiscal transfers. Dalio said in multiple interviews between 2019 and 2023 that this combination historically leads to currency debasement, rising inequality, and political tension. Dalio has been a vocal critic of over-reliance on monetary policy. After the 2008 financial crisis, central banks globally adopted quantitative easing. Balance sheets expanded dramatically. The U.S. Federal Reserve's balance sheet grew from under $1 trillion in 2007 to over $9 trillion by 2022. This liquidity stabilized markets, but distorted price signals. Dalio argued that QE inflated asset prices disproportionately, benefiting asset owners while wages lagged. This widened wealth gaps and fueled populism. He warned that once inflation returned, central banks would be forced to tighten policy into fragile debt structures. This creates a dilemma: tighten and risk recession, or ease and risk currency erosion. Dalio described this as a lose-lose environment typical of late-cycle systems. Dalio has consistently framed inflation as a form of taxation. When money supply grows faster than productivity, purchasing power declines. Following the COVID-19 stimulus, US M2 money supply increased by over 40% in less than 2 years. Inflation followed, peaking above 9% in 2022, the highest in 4 decades. Dalio warned early that inflation was not transitory. He argued that supply constraints, fiscal dominance, and geopolitical fragmentation would sustain price pressures. He also emphasized that inflation affects social stability. Historically, periods of high inflation correlate with labor unrest and political extremism. Dalio's message was not that inflation would spiral uncontrollably, but that real returns on cash and bonds would suffer, forcing investors to reassess risk. Dalio's most serious warning concerns how long-term debt cycles end. Historically, there are only 4 mechanisms: growth, austerity, wealth transfers, money printing. Growth is insufficient when debt is too large. Austerity is politically unpopular. This leaves restructuring through inflation or default. Dalio studied historical cases including the 1930s United States, post-war Britain, and modern Japan. His conclusion was that advanced economies tend to choose financial repression, keeping interest rates below inflation to erode debt silently. Dalio said explicitly in his book Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order that this process is already underway. This does not imply collapse. It implies lower real returns and higher volatility. Dalio expanded his framework beyond economics to geopolitics. He argued that economic cycles intersect with power cycles. Historically, reserve currencies rise and fall alongside empires. The Dutch guilder, British pound, and US dollar each dominated during periods of economic, military, and institutional strength. Dalio has been clear that the US dollar remains dominant, but its position is being challenged. Rising multipolar trade, sanctions, and alternative payment systems signal gradual fragmentation. Dalio warned that reserve currency status is lost slowly, then suddenly. Ray Dalio is not predicting a crash. He is warning about constraints. High debt limits policy. Currency debasement erodes trust. Inequality fuels division. History shows that these forces resolve through structural change, not smooth adjustment. Dalio's message is often misinterpreted as pessimism. In reality, it is realism. He believes cycles are inevitable, but outcomes depend on preparation. His final warning is not about markets. It is about complacency, the belief that this time is different. History suggests it rarely is. The next economic cycle will not look exactly like the last, but its mechanics are already visible to those willing to study them. That, according to Ray Dalio, is the real warning.